Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to take this opportunity again to welcome you to this presentation and to this channel. I am Professor Oriaso Odongo, and my channel, as usual, is Professor Oriaso Odongo Knowledge Hub. Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to talk to you about issues of climate change and specifically climate change mitigation and related policies and legislations. Now, this presentation is important, and I want to break it down into 5 segments. The first segment will give us a bit about climate change mitigation. The second one will deal with the approaches to climate mitigation. And then the third one will be around the application of international mechanisms. And then the last one will be around the place of local mechanism in addressing mitigation. Welcome. Mitigation and adaptations are 2 related concepts and even practice, and they are climate response mechanisms that we have. They only differ in the sense that when you talk about mitigation, we are dealing with the measures that are put in place to check the root causes of climate change. For example, if you want to reduce the greenhouse gases, all those activities, all those practices, all those measures that you put in place, particularly to reduce them, to reduce heat-trapping gases, to reduce ODS, ozone depletion substances. If you go that way, you say that you want to completely refuse climate change from happening, then we talk about mitigation. However, adaptations are normally built on the knowledge that climate change is already real, and the impacts of climate change are there, and so ways by which people can live with them, ways by which you can reduce the vulnerability and promote resilience. Those are the ones that we call adaptation. So many times you look at the 2 concepts, they look similar, and in that they are both response mechanisms. The only difference is the level at which they operate. Normally, what we are talking about here is climate change has had a lot of impact on people. And if we were to practice business as usual, as we keep on saying, we really suffer greater impact of the same. So mitigation measures are important, and I want to concentrate on those mitigation measures. So if you have those actions that you undertake with the aim of limiting the magnitude of climate change at any scale, then we call them that. Remember what we had said, the studies have shown that climate change mostly the result of those human activities. We call them anthropogenic activities. And these activities are the ones that lead to production of greenhouse gases that we have mentioned, like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, and even halogens. And don't forget about the ozone depleting substances that we've been able to talk about. And now we know that climate change is normally a global phenomenon, what we call the public common issue. So because of this, the entire globe requires to cooperate with the aim of mitigating it. Remember, we had said that even if one nation had to really have very versatile response mechanisms and the others don't, then the extent to which it will succeed still remains a little questionable. So mitigation policies come to bind nations. We look at that. These policies can be really, really important, and they can substantially reduce the risk which associate with human-induced climate change. And remember, climate change is connected with global warming. I think I've mentioned this global warming in the other presentations. So climate change mitigation requires cooperation of individual countries, regions, and communities at international level. We require that. Because normally, what we normally say is that even if we were to address climate change by reducing greenhouse gases, we currently have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, and to be able to live with this, that is where the adaptation issues come through. So you can imagine this is what we're talking about. So there are so many mitigation of measures that we take. For this presentation today, I want to just mention those that are very common. Like we had mentioned, switching to low carbon energy sources. So there is actually a debate around that. So what are these low carbon energy sources that we normally revert to? The second one is when we expand to forest and carbon sinks. Look at forest and carbon sinks. What are they? Mention them. If we do the third one, encouraging energy efficiency. What is energy efficiency? I'll just get it to you. What about energy conservation, number 4? And then the number 5 one is promoting climate engineering. We have been able to hear about climate engineering. I want to talk about it today. And then increasing fuel economy. So how do we increase fuel economy? Then the 7th one is adopting individual and community lifestyles, even at the level of organizations. If we change our lifestyle, things change. Then we get into all processes or activities that stabilize greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Let me pick each and every one of them and talk about them. The first one we mentioned is about shifting to low carbon sources. So what are those low carbon sources we are talking about? We're talking about energy sources that normally produce power, and we use them. But then in the course of doing so, it does release that power by releasing quite a small amount of carbon. So we say all those sources of energy which produce power with the low amount of carbon, which is the main thing that causes greenhouse gases. If we use that, then and they include sources like wind power, sources like solar power. You know about solar power, hydroelectric power, tidal power, and other processes like fuel separation and decomposing. We even go over and above and bring in geothermal power and carbon capture and storage. I think I'll mention that. And the good thing about these low carbon sources is that they normally are renewable sources of energy. Apart from being renewable, they have several attributes that make us want to shift to them so that we can mitigate climate change effectively. Some of those attributes are the ones I want to mention, like they produce very low quantity of total life cycle carbon, being the ingredient. This is which is most important in greenhouse. They are also renewable and recyclable. If that energy is renewable, it means it's safe. They are also natural sources, and they are environmentally friendly. That's what we are talking about. They are also very cost-effective sources of energy, and above all, they obey the natural systems that we have. So in mining and using such energy, we call them clean energy sources. You are compliant with the requirement of environment. Then the second one, I talked about using carbon sinks. What are those carbon sinks? Carbon sinks may be natural or artificial reservoirs that accumulate and store carbon, for example. Why do people plant trees? Why do we encourage people to do afforestation or reforestation, for example? We want to ensure that we have good vegetation cover, for example. What happens is what we call the carbon sequestration. There are two ways to looking at it, but I want to just explain it simply by making reference to a process like photosynthesis. What normally happens when such a process happens, the plants normally consume carbon dioxide, and by doing so, they remove it from the atmosphere. So any process, whether biological or non-biological, that aims at removing carbon from the atmosphere, we call that carbon sequestration. The main aim of those processes are just to reduce the chances of global warming from further happening. And I think I'd mentioned about those two processes. We have the natural process also. We have that, and then we have the artificial processes. So the natural one is the one I just mentioned, photosynthesis, for example, and what we are calling the absorption of carbon by means of physical-chemical processes. I think we will mention those, even biological processes happening in oceans. And then the artificial ones include like doing landfills. If we dig landfills and landfills where a huge amount of carbon dioxide is stored so that it is not released anyhow into the environment. That is what we are talking about. Or we talk about carbon capture and storage, those processes that we're talking about. A process of really taking carbon and carbon waste from maybe fossil fuels and keeping it very far away from leaking into that place. So you can imagine that. So then the third one we're talking about is improving energy efficiency. So what is energy efficiency? Maybe sustainable use of energy. Or if you reduce the amount of energy that you want to use, particularly in your homes or in industries. And there are many ways you can go about improving that energy efficiency, like insulating your home so that your home uses less heating, for example, or using fluorescent tubes like the one I have in my place here, which uses a small amount or little amount of energy to light, or using natural light, having your windows open all the time when you are seated. You don't have to use energy. Or using low consumption appliances. So whenever you are buying appliances like fridge, ovens, dishwashers, and all this, you ensure that you choose those that do not consume amount of energy. And using appropriate building designs. So it even extends to the building designs. And then the fourth one I mentioned was energy conservation. So using less energy to achieve a service. And it also boils down to behavior, lifestyles, and social change, for example. So how would we be able to do that? If you have an institutional change, or you have social change, or an individual change in mindset with regard to how we use or how we conserve the energy that we have, like maybe driving less. Is it possible that people who have their cars can leave cars at home? Because cars will still use fuel, and you know what fuel will do. What about if we heat less, particularly during winter, if we heat less? Or if we get adapted to using less bright rooms, is it possible that those are things we can do? So when we involve storage of energy, even for future use, we're talking about conservation. And if we even resort to using locally available means to power our homes or to power one's activities, those are the ones we are calling processes that encourage energy conservation. And there have been a lot of benefits of energy conservation. Why do we conserve? Maybe we want to save so that we reduce cost of doing things. Who does not want to reduce cost of doing things? And it also goes to reducing carbon emissions. So if you conserve energy, for example, if you drive less, today across the world you find people are driving vehicles that are quite old, and what normally happens, they exude a lot of carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide, which are the ones we are talking about. So if you happen to drive less, so you stop emitting, for example, you're reducing the world's energy needs. If you conserve, you control emission of greenhouse gases, for example. You just stop being dependent on energy, or you really practice sustainable development. That development I had talked about previously in my presentation. You're encouraging local actions that you will be able to reduce emissions and promote local responsibility at that level. So you can look at that. Then the sixth one, I talked about forestation and reforestation. I had mentioned a process called carbon sequestration, for example. Here is a case of biosequestration process. If you plant trees, and many countries have got agenda about tree planting. We have countries saying by 2030, by 2035, we will have this kind of plant on vegetation cover or trees that will have planted. Why would we do this? So that we can have that seamless process of removing carbon from the atmosphere. And that is much more effective mitigation of measure. And we can do a lot with trying to reforest. When we deforest, we replant, and there are many policies that help us to be able to do that. And then I also mentioned about climate engineering. So this is climate engineering. What does it mean? It's almost the same as geoengineering. Geoengineering. What normally happens, I would give just a small, short example. In oceans, what normally happens? We could talk about ocean fertilization. So if you fertilize oceans, what do you think happens? There will be aquatic life there. And then they will be consuming carbon monoxide, or that they will be consuming carbon dioxide. And that is one of the ways by which you remove the greenhouse gases. And then those processes are really mentioned, like carbon dioxide removal. We remove them through even carbon capture and storage, those that I had already mentioned before, or directing the already captured carbon somewhere far from that. And the one I just mentioned about ocean fertilization, you can look at that. So we even have a second other process apart from the biosequestration that I just mentioned, like solar radiation management. So how do you talk about, how do you bring in that to really become an effective mitigation of measure under climate engineering, for example? Look at deflecting. If we deflect sunlight away from somewhere, then global warming will technically be stopped. Or when we screen out sunlight to reduce greenhouse effects. I think greenhouse effects is an idea that I've been able to mention and talk about greatly in some of the previous presentations I've made. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can see, so we talk about mitigation, and then we talk about the general techniques or strategies that can quickly be used. I've been able to mention the shifting to low carbon sources. I also mentioned using carbon sinks. So mentioned the use of energy efficiency, and I've been able to contextualize this, energy conservation, the use of afforestation and reforestation, as well as the use of geoengineering or climate engineering techniques. Look at those. Please read a lot about that and see how they are normally contextualized. I want to go to the second bit of the presentation I just mentioned. So what are some of the sector-specific climate mitigation measures that we can talk about? We have many sectors of our economy, like the transport sector. What are some of the mitigation measures that are put there? Like in transport sector, many countries have got ways by which they address climate change, or they check climate change in that sector. Say, for example, using energy efficient technologies. Today we have those, we thought like those technologies would not really come, but today you see electric vehicles around, hydrogen cars. So there are things that are reality, even in remotest places. I see a lot of them even doing rounds where I'm seated at the moment. Shifting from track to electric rail. Look at the railway system. Look at that. So we look at the low carbon propelled automobiles. Look at the use of renewable energy. So we've been able to do that. And if you look at the transport sector generally, it does constitute some great percentage with regard to the emission of greenhouse gases. You can see, if it is checked, then we can be comfortable saying that we're doing something about reducing greenhouse gases and global warming and consequently climate change. Look at urban planning, for example. Urban planning. We've seen tremendous growth in urbans, particularly through different development approaches that countries adopt. Like our country, Kenya, for example, adopted the county system, the national and county system. Even small towns that used to be just very small are nowadays big and overgrown. So what do we do in urban planning, knowing that when we do this planning, we need to be very sensitive to climate change, for example. Maybe reducing sprawls. If you reduce sprawls, you tend to do something using public as opposed to private transport systems we had already mentioned, reducing the amount of land use. So is it possible that you can only use just a small bit of your land to enhance urbanization, as opposed to trying to put concrete everywhere, for example? Or reducing smart growth practices. Look at those kind of practices that we call smart growth. Like having compacted community development. So what do we mean by compacted development? For example, where people will go and live in just one place and leave the rest for agriculture, leave the rest for vegetation, or certain things. Multiple transport system and choices. So you could have multiple, but you ensure that within such compacted communities, you only retain those that use clean technology, for example, mixed land uses, conserving the green spaces. Even in towns, even in urban areas, so there's a possibility that we can reserve green spaces. We even have walkable places, so that we even limit chances of vehicles moving around everywhere. So you can even have pavements where you just cycle, and it has been able to happen quite a great deal of urban areas across the globe because of very good planning. We also practice new urbanism. Look at new urbanism. What is new urbanism, for example? Where I was saying we have walkable neighborhoods. You don't build houses everywhere. You leave spaces where people can walk around, where people can play, where you can grow vegetation and improve the cover, for example. Having self-centered neighborhoods. So what are those self-centered neighborhoods, for example? Traditional neighborhood design. So how do they look? What is traditional neighborhood looking like? I remember when people used to be communal. A large number of people, like 50 houses are built in one place. Those are the things we are talking about. Transport-oriented development, regionalism, and all that. What about the building sector, for example? Look at sustainable architecture, for example, the building sector. The building sector has developed that. Green building, look at the green building, for example. Passive solar buildings, where you have windows, walls, and floors that can collect and store light. So when we ultimately lose it, we can still use the one that had already been done. Or low energy building, buildings that use very little energy, power, from their design and technology. You can imagine how that happens. Or the practice of sustainable designs, energy efficiency on landscaping and all those. So zero energy buildings that do not require a lot of energy expenditures. We have them. I don't know whether we can mention a building or a story house with glasses all over. In the social control sector, what are some of the mitigation of measures that we can put here and talk about? Maybe carbon taxation. So it's the main thing at the moment. Carbon tax. You can introduce the tradable carbon credits, for example. Encourage people to reduce carbon by lifestyle changes, or by making people to pay if they were to emit. So the emitter pays principle, if you look at that. Or educating people on the economics of climate change, so that people would really see the actual costs, the actual cost of the impact of climate change, so that they are able to contend with ways and means of reducing it. Within the population sector, we also have certain control mechanisms. We call them mitigation mechanisms, like population, like using birth control measures. Imagine if we have the problems of climate change and we have problems of overpopulation, you can see now we have double-headed problems. So we could go doing that. Now, climate change mitigation is possible because we had said, I mentioned something initially, that climate change mitigation ought to be a collective effort. And at this level, we're mentioning how is it possible to make it a collective effort? Probably we look at the international and the national policies, or even local policies. So we have a climate change policy. So you just mentioned that climate change is a global issue. It's a global phenomenon. And its impacts are also very global. Remember what I said, that even if one particular nation or one particular country or district is able to do very well in mitigation, and the other districts within the country is not doing anything, or they are not doing anything, we might be counterproductive in what you are doing. So what is it that makes the global community to join hands so that they come up with interventions or efforts that will address mitigation? So those are the things we are looking at. So we require the international, regional, and local interventions in terms of the policies and legislations. And these policies and legislations are supposed to be good if at all they are consultative, if at all people come together to really develop them and accept to implement them to fight to fight climate change through reduction of greenhouse gases emissions. So you can look at that. So the entire climate change regulation or mitigation policies and regulation can only be discussed within we talked about the United Nations and its role. Look at the United Nations and its role. And then the state parties to this convention, state parties to the climate change legislation. So if there is that understanding, it would be important. And all countries need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by adopting clean energy. And these policies, these international policies, these regional policies, these national and local policies, their main aim as regards mitigation revolve around emissions reduction, for example. They intend to reduce emissions. They're supposed to, number two, encourage or promote renewable energy use. They're supposed to increase energy efficiency and conservation. And then the last one, they're supposed to build capacity, particularly of less developed or developing countries or nations, to be able to withstand the shocks that climate change will cause. And poor countries are particularly very hard hit by climate change. Why? Because they have weak infrastructure. So for them, they don't need to joke when it comes to matters of climate mitigation informed by this global or regional or national or local policies, for example. They have weak infrastructures. They also have weak policies. They have poor implementation goodwill, for example. So poor countries and developing countries are still yearning to develop to reach the level of the developed ones. So if they don't develop a mindset that will really help, then things will go bad. They depend on developed countries, for example. They have very few social services to intervene in case climate risks come around. And if you look at countries that are very successful with regard to mitigation, there are a number of things that they do. There are some of the features that normally pervade them. Like they have reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So how is that possible? Which countries do this? I don't want to mention them here. The greenhouse gas taxes are very high, so they're already implementing carbon taxes, and it's very high for an emitter, for example, to continue doing so. There is no subsidy on foreign products. So if there are foreign products which are likely to really cause problems, so those that are going to lead to emissions, there are no subsidies given to them. And then there is also the low fossil fuel per capita. You can look at those countries. They have local control on import of illegal energy. So even though some of them are dependent, and then they have very strong legislations and goodwill. And if this is possible, then I think they become countries that can show examples of mitigation efforts. I think I want to talk about international climate change mitigation policy instruments, just some of them, so that we can. I want to make reference to Kyoto Protocol. I want to make reference to the Paris Agreement, and so that we can get to see what international legislations are there to support mitigation. Then I will also go to the local and national mechanisms. So key international legislations dealing with mitigation could be the Kyoto Protocol. I think I mentioned the Paris Agreement. Let me just start with the Kyoto Protocol, for example. The Kyoto Protocol is actually known to many of us. It is one of the national treaties that was signed around the greenhouse gas emissions. And it was meant to reduce global warming. And it is the one that extends the 1992 UNFCCC Convention. I think I've been able to mention that. And it did commit state parties to reduce that emission. And it was based on the fact that global warming and climate change is already real, and not doing something about it would worsen the situation. And this treaty was adopted in Kyoto in Japan in 1997. And it entered into force in 2005. And by that time, it already had 192 members. And the very critical thing about the Kyoto Protocol was that it aimed at fighting global warming by reducing global greenhouse gas concentration that we are talking about. but it was so constrained by a principle called common but differentiated responsibility. The thinking was that developed nations were having a major obligation in the current state of affairs with regard to greenhouse gases. They were blamed for being responsible for the high amount of global climate change, for example. So this Kyoto Protocol was signed among 37 industrialized nations, and the first commitment was 2008, 2012, and the second commitment was 2012, 2020. And I think this is what was ratified in Paris in 2015, which actually was furthered by the Paris Agreement. So this second agreement I'm talking about was negotiated in December 2015 at the Conference of State Parties in Paris, France. And it is what became the Paris Agreement. And it has done a lot. Some of the mitigation measures that we can say directly emanate from Kyoto Protocol would include the emission taxes that we are talking about. Emission tax, any environmental tax which is paid by individual emitters. So if you emit greenhouse gas, you pay. And then the second one that has been, as a result of this, is making carbon dioxide emission illegal. And the third one is about introducing subsidies. So giving subsidies when people use renewable energy. If you convert into solar energy, and then you be given subsidy, particularly with regard to initial investment in the same. And then we talk about the carbon emission trading that is currently being talked about. And Kyoto Protocol has also had the challenges. So many people still had issues with it, like this uncertainty. People still do not understand the impact of climate change uniformly. We would have imagined that if people understand it uniformly, things will be better. And we also have a fragmentation in terms of information around climate change. People still call into different knowledge sources climate change. People are referring to cosmic. People who do not even want to rely on scientific evidences around climate change. And then we have institutional void, so lack of enabling legislation. So many countries are still toying around implementing global policies. They're not even able to have observance of regional one, leave alone coming up with stronger national policies around mitigation. Then the short-time horizon policies and politicians, and then the missing motives and willingness to start adopting these things. So there's a lot of those issues that we are talking about. And then I want to quickly go to the Paris Agreement. And I talk about Paris Agreement is as a result of COP21 entered upon on 12th of December 2015 when the discussion around climate change in Paris started and happened. And the parties who are members of UNFCCC reached a landmark decision or agreement to combat climate change and to accelerate and intensify actions that are meant to bring sustainable low-carbon future in these member states. I think that's. Then we say that it opened for signatures in April 2016 during the Earth Day at the UN headquarters in New York. And you can imagine by 2017, it had already had 125 members signing it. As of 2019, the Paris Agreement had already had 189 members out of 197 UNFCCC members, you can imagine. And the central aim of the Paris Agreement were to strengthen global response to climate change by keeping temperature below 2 degrees and then ultimately to reduce it even further to 1.5 degrees. The second one was to increase ability of countries to deal with the impacts of climate change. And then the third one was to make financial flow consistent with greenhouse gas emissions. So if a country was doing much to be able to limit or to prevent further emissions, they would really be financed to do so. Promoting adaptation, the element of adaptation came in so that we get very clear mechanisms like nationally determined contributions. How are you going to really come up with measures to address climate change? particularly through adaptation, increasing capacity of vulnerable communities. That was an important, and which strategies was espoused in this agreement. Espoused strategies like resource mobilization, and it was actually agreed and that member states would really resource for finances to manage adaptation and manage mitigation. New technology frameworks are going to adopt technology, capacity building around climate change and responses, supporting developing and vulnerable countries, probably through contributions that we today know as climate finance, a climate fund, for example, and then enhancing capacity of transparency, framework for actions. I think those are very important spouses of the Paris Agreement. Some of the principles in this agreement is that all parties must put best efforts to be able to fight climate change, particularly through the nationally determined contributions and NDCs. I think we talked about them initially. So all parties are supposed to regularly report emissions, including the implementation efforts they're putting in place. All parties were to implement global stock tech so that we kind of have accumulation of stock tech generally across the globe. We have voluntary support for developing countries that are struggling are supposed to be supported. And the main focus areas, so let me just mention quickly the main focus area of Paris Agreement. Look at the long-term temperature goals. I think I've been able to mention that. So the intention was to really check temperature and long-term temperature by limiting it to 2 degrees and eventually to 1.5 to increase global peaking or climate neutrality. We reach global peak. And then the third one is around mitigation. Parties to prepare and communicate NDCs that are supposed to be communicated. Sinks and reservoirs. So parties are supposed to conserve sinks by having plans around vegetation improvement, increasing tree cover. Many countries are doing that at the moment. Voluntary cooperation with market and non-marketing. Voluntary cooperation, I think I mentioned that. Adaptation is coming in big scales. Parties to establish global goals for adaptations. I don't think those are the main thing. They also boil down to loss and damage. So if you lose through climate change impact, for example, so you develop sustainable means, then finance, technology, and capacity. Those are issues that are also in a Paris Agreement. Climate change education, training, awareness, and then global stock tech, having data and transparency, and a lot. I think those are the main things I can quickly mention about the international legislations. But I don't want to end this if I don't mention a bit about local responses. Much as we've been able to say that climate change mitigation is supposed to be a global thing, a global response, just like climate change is a global phenomenon. We may not sit pretty that things will happen at global level. So local response mechanisms are important. So apart from the regional and international mitigation options that we are having, individuals, businesses, the CBOs, and community bodies need to do something about that. And these are what we call the local mechanisms. So what are they supposed to do? Quite a lot. Like individually, what would you do? What kind of lifestyle change would you adopt? As institutions, what kind of things will you put in place to enhance adaptation, mitigation adaptation, for example? I just mentioned some like lowering home heating and supporting renewable energy. You can do that. Buying and consuming local products so that you don't bring in foreign products that are a bit dangerous sometimes. Reducing air transport, shipments, or using alternative means of transport. That I think I've been able to mention this. Reducing environmental impacts of aviation or any, we mentioned those. Fuel efficiency, those are things that we can do attempting to at litigation. So how is that possible at local level? So what if somebody destroys your trees? What do? You know that your trees will help you, but they will also be able to help environment. So what about litigation? Is it possible? Lobbying and advocacy so that people have good behavior. So those are some of the things that we can talk about with regard to mitigation. So ladies and gentlemen, I think I've been able to talk about climate change mitigation, and I told you what it is, and I separated it from adaptation, and I also gave you a bit of the general strategies that people use in mitigation. Then I also went to look at mitigation per sector, and after that I went to talk about the policies and legislations around mitigation, and I went to talk about the international, and then I mentioned a bit of regional, and then local and national. I want to stop there, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to keep reminding you to remember to like, to share, and to subscribe to this channel. I intend to give you more and more exciting opportunities to listen and learn. Thank you so much, and this is only available on my channel, Professor Oriaso Odongo Knowledge Hub. Thank you.